Hey, what's up? Today on Modern Mobile, we're going to talk a little bit about Pressables in React Native. So React Native version 0.63 was released in July of 2020, so a little while ago. And one of the big things that came with it was this Pressable component. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. So React Native does these like really cool blog updates on all the things that come out. And they have a good section on the Pressable API and why they even released it. And the TLDR of this thing is basically like React Native's getting really good, and the touchable components weren't really keeping up with these updates. And then there's also some information on here about how like there's sort of this bootstrap CSS effect going on where basically everybody just used touchable opacity or touchable highlight in the React Native app. And so if you're using an app, and you could probably identify if it's React Native or not just based on the touchable type. So actually, in this announcement, they linked to their documentation. The Pressable documentation is really good. This is some really nice documentation. So if you skim through here, they actually have some like how it works, how you can tap into the press, like life cycle of the press gesture. And they also have this really cool diagram, which is really neat. So they show you sort of like the life cycle of this thing. So there's a whole lot of stuff in here. And they actually have they kind of distinguish between hit rectangles and press rectangles, which is really cool. So I recommend you go through and kind of check this out just to see what all you can do with this. But what I want to do is actually go through sort of a basic example of how to use the Pressable API, some of the like surface level things that are different about it, and how you might actually use it to just like replace like old touchable opacities or old touchable components from React Native, because they kind of recommend you do that and start moving away from the touchables, which might mean they might deprecate those in the future at some point, but we'll see in a little bit. So here I have some content. I just have some filler content. Over here in the simulator, you can see I actually have just sort of an image and some text here. And we're going to create what I'm calling my plain Jane touchable opacity. All I'm basically going to do is replicate the old touchable opacity. And I've got some styles for this thing. So there's some like flex stuff and a background color and so on. So first thing, let's go ahead and like make this plain Jane touchable opacity and sort of replicate the old, like the touchable opacity that comes out of React Native. So basically what I have here is I have some props. What I'm going to do is actually make it so my touchable opacity props are, we're going to take the Pressable props and leave out the style property. And then we're going to use like a simplified style property of style prop, taking in view style, which this is sort of like allows you to do the styling that you would normally do on a view. So you can pass in an array of object styles or style objects, or just a single style object, or nothing. So this is what our props are going to look like here. And we'll see why we're going to simplify the style a little bit. So in my plain Jane touchable opacity, this is going to be a pretty generic component. So I'm pulling out basically all of the props and I'm just passing them right through to Pressable right now. So right now there's like not really anything interesting happening here. I can press on this plain Jane touchable opacity, but nothing happens. The magic's going to come when we actually use this new style prop. So the Pressable API gives you, instead of the old school style property that looks something like this, they actually let you do that, or you can give it a function. So you can actually give it a function with this, we'll call it args as the arguments, and then we can return an array of styles back here is what we're going to do. Basically what we're going to do is, as I start to type, we see that this argument object actually has a pressed property, which tells us when the thing is pressed. So we can actually do args.pressed. If it's pressed, let's go ahead and just apply an opacity of 0.3. So let's see if that didn't seem to update. Let's go ahead. Oh, I need to also pull out my style. So we're going to pull out the style here to make sure it's not getting overridden. And now we can see our style's kind of broke here, but you can see that as I press this in, our opacity drops to 0.3. I let go, it goes back to 1. So now what we need to do is actually get this style to pass through. And I don't want to waste a whole lot of time, so I'm going to paste in some pre-cooked code. Looks like I missed a period. So basically what I'm doing here is the style property that's coming in, it could be an array. of styles. And if it's an array of styles, we're going to spread out that array. Otherwise, we're going to create an array with whatever that style is and then spread it out. So now we can see that we actually have this touchable opacity, which works basically the same way that the touchable opacity would if you imported it from React Native. So that's pretty neat. It's kind of plain Jane here. All we're really doing is applying an opacity, but this is one of the cool mechanisms of the Pressable API, where you can actually do like these dynamic styles based on whether or not the pressable is pressed in. So that's sort of the baseline version. All right, let's go ahead and make a maybe more interesting one. So in the blog post that React Native released, they kind of like hinted at the fact that everybody's using these sort of basic touchable components, and so there's not a whole lot distinguishing between apps that are using React Native. They're all, using similar touchables. So what we're going to do is basically just make like a slightly fancier version of this. And instead of just dropping the opacity immediately, which is what this does, we're going to animate the opacity. We're going to add a nice little effect to this. So what I'm going to do is actually, we're going to add in a spacer here. And we're going to create another one. We're going to do an animated touchable opacity. It's this other component that we're going to make. We're going to pass it the same stuff. So I'll just copy that, paste it on in. And right now that component is doing the same thing we were doing before. There's nothing really interesting happening here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull out a few things. We're going to pull out the style. I think we'll go ahead and pull out the on press in and on press out. We're going to tap into these press in and press out events. Now what we're going to do is actually create an animated value. So we're going to create a new ref. We'll call it press in progress. And we're going to do a new animated dot value of 0. So we're just going to create like an animated value from React Native's animated API. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to pass in some styles. So we're going to simplify this a little bit. So we're going to, let me pull some code. So we're going to do the same sort of like styling thing we did before, where we're going to use the style that comes in as a prop. But what we're going to do is actually create an opacity value that's animated. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's create this opacity value. And opacity is really just, we're going to take this press in progress and we're going to interpolate it. But let's pause on that for now, because I think the more important part here is what we're going to do is tap into this on press in event, which gives us an event with some information. And we're going to pipe that through on into the props if we need to. So on press in, we're going to do some optional chaining here. This basically says like, hey, if the user passes in a prop for this, go ahead and call it with the event object. Otherwise, just short circuit. So we'll pass that through. And then what we're going to do is actually do an animated dot timing. We're going to animate this press in progress to a value of 1. So we're going to say, all right, we're pressing it in. Let's animate this value to 1. And we're going to use the native driver because we pretty much always should if we can. We're going to do a duration of 150 milliseconds. And we actually need to start this thing. All right, so we're going to do the same thing on press out. So when the user lets out, when we let out of this thing, we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to forward the event on through, and then what we're going to do is animate this press in progress back to 0. We're going to say, hey, we're done with this thing. Let's animate that back to 0. So then what we're going to do is actually use this press in progress, because that's animating from 0 to 1 when you press it in, and then when you let go, it goes back to 0. So what we're going to do is take this press in progress. We're just going to interpolate this thing. So we're going to do an input range of 0 to 1, because that's what the press in progress varies from. Output range of, we're going to start with the opacity of 1 and animate to 0. And then we're going to extrapolate. We're going to do clamp. We don't want to like extend beyond this thing. All right. So now we're going to use that opacity value. We're just going to pass in an inline style for the style here. And we're probably going to get yelled at, I'm guessing, because yeah. Right now, we're trying to pass an animated style to Pressable, and Pressable is not animated. So we actually need to use, let's call this animated Pressable. We need to use the animated APIs, create animated component. We'll pass in the Pressable, and this allows us to basically just give this thing. It should allow us to give it animated styles, but for some reason, something's going on here. Type of property opacity. Oh, I forgot to change it up here. Duh. Animated Pressable. All right. Let's go ahead and refresh. All right, so here's our old one. And now you can see when we press in, we animate our opacity. Maybe I'll crank that duration up just a little bit so we can see this a little better. Let's do like 600 milliseconds. So that's a slow fade, but as you press in, animate the opacity, let out, opacity out. So 150 actually feels like a pretty good amount of time. So we go from the kind of plain Jane touchable opacity to a one that has a little pizzazz to it. Give it a little animation. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about with Pressables today. There's actually a lot to explore here. You should check it out, go see what you can do, start making your own Pressables. It's actually pretty friendly to use and pretty fun to make your own Pressables.